Ableism and the workplace. What is the role of social work? This is the agenda for today's presentation. First, we have session expectations, which will be followed by defining ableism and saneism. Then we will also go into differentiating between visible and invisible disabilities, looking at the definition of disability from various models and looking at who is classified as disabled. We will then look at accommodation versus accessibility and barriers to accessibility, followed by inclusive spaces. Next up would be language use, then looking at ableism and saneism in the workplace, and then finally finishing with what is the role of social work in all this and why does this matter to our practice. For this presentation, we asked that there are session expectations. Specifically, we're asking to actively engage with the content, to ask questions when needed, when wanted, and remember, everyone says there's no such thing as a silly question, but truly there isn't. And this kind of goes in to give others space for learning. Everybody comes from a different skill point, viewpoint, vantage point, a different privilege, and it's good to respect all those and assume that everybody's approaching this with good intent. And that also ties into the last point, respect the identities and experiences of others. Using person-first language. I wanted to address this first and foremost before going into the presentation, as I often interchangeably use the words person with a disability versus disabled person. There's been a big push in social work specifically on using person-first language. So that's person with a disability. This you can say versus disabled person. So historically, when you said disabled, that's used as a slur against someone. And there's the argument that person with a disability is person first, so it centers the person and not their condition. So it really empowers the person. And you might be thinking, well, what language should I use then? So a lot of members in the disability community actually prefer to be called disabled. It's not a dirty word. It's just a very real experience. And once we get into the social model of disability, you might understand why saying disabled is not a bad thing. Best practice, though, means using the language preferences from your clients. If you're not sure, ask. People will usually describe themselves in certain ways, and it's important to mirror the language that they're using. And if they haven't, and this does come up, it's okay to ask people. That's more respectful than assuming what they prefer to be called. So again, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be using disabled, as this presentation is prepared by someone who self-identifies as a disabled social worker, and that is the terminology that I prefer to use. So before we really get in and begin to talk about in depth what is ableism and saneism and what does that look like in our practice, what does that look like in the workplace, it's important to define what is ableism and what is saneism. So this slide is looking at defining ableism, which is an important starting point that the rest of our presentation will rely on. So ableism is a systemic form of oppression that works to disable people and target people with disabilities. Ableism works in collaboration with other systems of oppression, like the patriarchy and sexism, so that women are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness while also experiencing paternalistic dismissal of symptoms compared to men. Ableism also works in collaborations with other systems of oppression, such as racism, particularly anti-Black racism. For example, by denying healthcare to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, systems further marginalize BIPOC as both underrepresented in diagnoses and overpathologized and policed by the medical system. Lastly, ableism works in collaborations with other systems of oppression, including the hetero-cis-normativity, so that queer and trans folk, particularly those of color, are more likely to be diagnosed with a disability, while also being the least represented in the disability rights movement. When defining ableism, it is also important to define the concept of saneism. Although saneism can be considered a subcategory of ableism, it is important for us to look at this specifically as it's quite pervasive in the lives of many clients that we work with. So when we're looking at saneism, we're looking at a systemic form of oppression and discrimination that works to disable people and target people who experience madness, or mental disorders, mental illness, or other ways of identifications. So we use the term mad and madness to describe all persons who self-identify as such or have otherwise been deemed mentally ill. It's important to understand that the word mad and madness are reclaimed words. These are words that were once used against the community in negative ways, and they have since been reclaimed and are used in a way that's empowering. So that's why we have the capital M on mad and madness. So when looking at ableism and saneism, we see that, okay, it's a systemic form of oppression that affects disabled folks, but specifically, who is disabled then? Who comes to experience ableism and saneism? So this is the definition in the Human Rights Code. Section 10(1) of the code defines disability as follows. Because of disability means for the reason that the person has or has had or is believed to have or have had 1. Any degree of physical disability, infirmity, malformation, or disfigurement that is caused by bodily injury, birth defect, or illness, and, without limiting the generality of the foregoing, includes diabetes mellitus, epilepsy, a brain injury, any degree of paralysis, amputation, lack of physical coordination, blindness or visual impediment, deafness or hearing impediment, muteness or speech impediment, or physical reliance on a guide dog or other animal, or on a wheelchair or remedial appliance or device. 2. A condition of mental impairment or developmental disability. 3. A learning disability or dysfunction in one or more of the processes involved in understanding or using symbols or spoken language. 4. A mental disorder. Or 5. An injury or disability for which benefits were claimed or received under the insurance plan established under the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act of 1997. So this is Who is Disabled continued, and it's important to understand that what was mentioned in the previous slide is a very formalized definition of disability and encompasses a lot of different impairments. We can also look at disability from the social model of disability, which states that disability is a consequence of environmental, social, and attitudinal barriers that prevent people with impairments from maximum participation in society. So it's kind of looking back at the previous slide, all those different 5 definitions of disability, and looking at perhaps it's not the impairments or the labels themselves that disable people, it's looking at the different ways that society disables these folks. So this is the definition of disability from the Disabled Peoples International. So the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in the normal life of the community on an equal level with others due to physical or social barriers. So we're defining disability and we're looking at what does ableism look like for folks. Something very big to point out within the disability community and when defining disability itself is the concept of visible versus invisible disabilities. So you may have seen this picture before that states some disabilities look like this, and it's cartoon images of various visible disabilities, such as someone using a walker, a cane, a guide stick, a mobility device, a wheelchair. And then underneath that, it says some look like this, and it's just a cartoon person standing with no obvious physical disabilities. And this is an important picture because it does represent that actually a lot of folks who make up the disability community don't have obvious visible disabilities. So when we're looking at this, it's important to note there is no specific image of what a person with a disability looks like. Many people can identify as disabled. Visible disabilities are what we tend to associate disability with, i.e. visual/auditory impairment using a mobility device such as a wheelchair or a walker. However, many people experience invisible disabilities, which means that they may appear able-bodied or normal, or specifically if we're thinking of Satanism again, able-minded, but may still experience physical, mental, cognitive, or psychiatric disabilities. So some examples here are arthritis, mental illness such as anxiety or bipolar disorder, or autism. Also, you might notice under the picture, there's included an image description. Image descriptions are put under images that require an explanation of what they look like. So it assumes that somebody looking at these slides might not be looking at them visually. They might be visually impaired. And so it's important to give the description of what they're looking at. We give image descriptions when the image is pertinent to the information being given. So if it's just there for aesthetic purposes, we wouldn't give an image description. But in this case, it was important to give an image description. Small things like that are ways that we can build inclusive communities for folks with disabilities, and that's something that we'll touch on later in this presentation. When looking at the definitions of disability, as touched on previously, there's different ways of conceptualizing the definition of the disability. The most mainstream framework that we tend to use when thinking about disability or thinking about someone who experiences ableism is through the lens of the medical model. So this would be the categorical method of defining persons with an illness or lack thereof. So if we think of something like the Diagnostic Standards Manual, so the DSM for short, as it's commonly known, we see that there's similar symptoms grouped together under categories of larger illnesses, and there can also be subcategories. And people, based on symptoms that they're said to have presented, would be diagnosed with a certain illness. And a main thing of the medical model is that it's very cure focused, meaning that the diagnosis of an illness renders the need for a complete solution. So making the quote unquote illness no longer present, or allowing folks to enter a state of quote unquote normality. And this is usually done within the medical model through physical or chemical means. A drawback of the medical model is that it does not touch on social aspects that are at interplay with the person. So as discussed in previous slides, perhaps it's not the impairments themselves that disable people, but rather it's society itself. So the medical model fails to acknowledge the larger depth of a person's life and all the different things that could be affecting them. So the medical model thus suggests that illness is inherently problematic and is intrinsic to the person. It suggests it's inherently problematic because it's cure focused. If the focus is to make it no longer present, then that's looking that you're starting from a deficit, that there's something wrong with someone, and that it's in them who they are, but it can be fixed most of the time. The medical model is also biologically science-based. So science is in quotations there because science is largely based on westernized ways of knowing, and it's what's come to be privileged as concrete knowledge. And there are many folks within the disability rights movement that have come to challenge this. What is disability is decided by institutions such as APA, the American Psychological Association, the CDC, the WHO, the World Health Organization. And then back to who is disabled is regulated by professionals. So typically those in the sciences. So psychiatrists, psychologists, and then you have doctors, specialists, etc. Another way of viewing the definition of disability is through the social model of disability. So the social model of disability is a direct response to the medical model based on the distress model. So essentially, the medical model was created by folks in positions of power. If we look at the sciences, psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors, etc., those folks are given a lot of privilege and power within society, especially the power to diagnose other people as quote unquote ill or disabled. The social model of disability really comes from the disability rights movement. It comes from people who experience disability themselves. And it's almost a reclamation of power in saying that the medical model does not fit for a lot of folks who experience disability, and that these are real factors that need to be taken into account when looking at disability. So for the purposes of this presentation, we will be relying more on the definition of the social model of disability. However, it is important to acknowledge that in a lot of social work practice contexts, the medical model of disability is the one that is commonly used. So it's the one that creates a shared language among professionals. It's one that allows folks access to services for quote unquote helping them. So even though we acknowledge that the medical model is the mainstream way of talking about disability, when looking at confronting ableism, it's important to understand the social model framework so that it can be challenged through the lens of folks who actually experience it. So the social model is focused on society's impacts on disability and disabling experiences. For example, if I was a person who was in a wheelchair and I wanted to go grab donuts from the local donut shop, and then I go there and they have 2 stairs leading up to their front door and no ramp, how am I supposed to get in that store? That would be a disabling experience. It's not me that's disabled in that, it's society not having a universal design and not having a ramp that allows me to go into the donut shop, and that's a disabling experience. The social model is also very important because it looks at the impacts of racialization, socioeconomic standing, gender, sexuality, a person's location, etc. It also accepts that disability may result in distress, and solutions to that distress may be desired by the individual. However, it is not cure-focused. So what this means is that, of course, a disability may result in distress. So even if there was something like universal design and society didn't disable folks, that doesn't take away from the very real experiences that they may encounter with pain associated with their disability. So of course it's looking at, you may require interventions and they can be medical, that could help the distress, but it's not cure focused. It's not saying I need to get rid of this. It's saying, how do I manage this? And the social model, the really big thing about it is that it emphasizes that there's natural diversity in ability and experience, and disability is determined by physical and social barriers. And if these barriers were removed, disability would no longer be defined. So if we think about it as there's natural variations in all sorts of human life. Some people have brown hair, some people have blonde hair, some people are tall, some people are short. Why does it not make sense that, of course, some people are able-bodied and some aren't? Some are able-minded, some aren't. And it's important when I'm making these distinctions that, of course, they sound like two binaries, but this is not a dichotomy. These concepts are often overlapping, and that's important to acknowledge, but it's really getting at that if we just accepted there was variation and there was no need for something like the medical model to quote unquote cure individuals because they don't meet the standards in which we've privileged, and those standards being an able-bodied, white, male, heterosexual Christian, anybody who kind of falls outside of those norms is deemed deviant or different, and there's a need or a want to fix these differences in a way. But if they were just accepted as natural diversity, and if disability itself is determined by those physical and social barriers spoken about before, then how would we be defining disability? So that's looking that it as a concept is completely socially defined and changes over time and place. It has come to be contextually defined as to what we know it now. So now that we've defined ableism, saneism, and what is disability and the various ways of conceptualizing that definition, it's important to look at accessibility versus accommodation. As we touched on in the social model, it states that if the barriers for folks were removed, then we would have to reconceptualize what is our definition of disability. And a large part of these barriers come from accessibility versus accommodation. So if we think about something back to that donut shop example, that is a clear architectural barrier, right? It's clearly not accessible for all folks unless you're able-bodied. So why is important to understand what is accessibility, versus what is accommodation. So the dictionary defines accessibility as capable of being used or seen, reached, or speak with or influenced, understood, and appreciated. So specifically, easily used or accessed by people with disabilities. So for example, back to that donut shop reference, if that store had a ramp, then you wouldn't experience that disability, right? It would be universally accessible. So real application of accessibility in a disability context focuses on dismantling ableist institutions by designing or planning for inclusivity to ensure disabled individuals can use and participate easily without alternative arrangement from our peers. So when we're looking at alternative arrangements in this definition, we're looking at accommodations made. So because it's not universally accessible, we have to have accommodations. So for many of us, inaccessibility influences and limits our ability to engage with the world around us, including our access to education, services, employment, and community. So this relates back to the social model of disability and how looking at society and the different ways that it can said to be ableist affects a disabled person's ability to navigate the world. So the dictionary defines accommodation as to provide something that is desired, suited, or needed, to give consideration to, or make fit or suitable. So the real application of accommodation in a disability context is when working within ableist institutions, disabled folks are often receive alternative arrangements in order to be accessible for us. Inaccessibility requires us to need accommodation in order to participate and requires energy on our part, whereas accessibility takes the pressure from us to self-advocate and puts forethought into design so that people with a variety of disabilities can participate. So why accessibility is so important is looking at that last line of the real application in a disability context. So we wouldn't require accommodations as much if there was universal design. If things were designed in such a way that took into consideration that there is just natural differences among people, and that includes ability, that includes physical ability, mental, etc. And it's looking at how can we account for that before structuring society, before structuring institutions, before structuring systems that privilege some over others. As spoken about earlier in this presentation, we look at ableism being the result of discrimination, whether that be attitudinal, architectural, organizational, communicational, or through technology. So these are the various types of accessibility barriers that create or make something ableist. So we have attitudinal, which are behaviors, perceptions, and assumptions that discriminate against persons with disabilities. Organizational, which are policies, procedures, or practices that unfairly discriminate and can prevent individuals from participating fully in a situation. There's architectural/physical, which are barriers and elements of the outer or inner architectural structure that creates difficulties for people with disabilities. So once again, back to that donut shop example, looking at that was a clear architectural barrier, physical barrier, because the person didn't have a way to enter that shop. Another type of accessibility barrier is communication/information. So information is presented in a way that not everyone can understand, i.e. something like academic jargon, right? So that privileges folks in academia to understand what those words are, whilst it's other folks might need it written in plain language, which could be argued to be like everyday talk. Another type of communication or information barrier is showing a video without subtitles, right? So that assumes that everybody doesn't have an auditory impairment, but there could be folks in the room that do, right? And lastly is technology. So device/technological platform that is not accessible to all members of intended audience and cannot be used with an assistive device. For example, a lot of folks who are visually impaired use screen readers to read their documents. And a lot of documents are actually not, sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not, like the technology that the person is using is not compatible. Sorry, that's the word. Is not compatible with the assistive device. So, for example, many PDFs are actually not compatible with screen readers. Most screen readers do much better interpreting and relaying information to the service user through Microsoft Word. So something as easy as that could be taken into consideration when going forward. So we've talked a lot now about ableism, saneism, defining disability, the various ways of understanding disability, looking at accessibility versus accommodation. And so we've got a lot of these abstract concepts, which I've tried to make concrete by using examples. But it's time to focus on what does ableism look like in our everyday life then. So there's a lot of different ways that ableism shows up in day-to-day lives. So these are some of the ways in which we can look at what does it appear like in everyday lives. So it kind of looks something like generalizing experiences. So it's important to understand that nobody experiences disability the same way. Even if you have the same diagnosis or same symptoms, everybody's experience is unique based on the intersections of their various social locations. So, a white, middle class, able bodied woman who has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder would experience her disability a lot different than an indigenous living in poverty woman who was diagnosed with the same thing, who uses, let's say, a mobility device. It also looks like microaggressions. So, an example is these are ways we use language to other people. And when we do this, it minimizes people's experiences. A good way that this can be understood is kind of like a backhanded compliment. So, for example, you can say something like, "Oh, I didn't even know that you had that. You would never know." Like, that insinuates that there's something bad, that people shouldn't know that somebody has a certain disability. And this minimizes people's experiences because it doesn't take into account their real lived reality. It also looks like inspiration porn. So, this is a concept used a lot in the disability rights movement, and it's something that actually happens a lot in mainstream society. So, it's when able bodied, so appearingly able bodied, of course, we can never know if somebody's able bodied just by looking at them. You have people like ambulatory wheelchair users, who are folks that only require wheelchairs sometimes, folks who only use canes sometimes, etc. So it's when able-bodied people use the experiences of disabled folks as inspirational motivation and to help make their experiences feel not, in quotations, as bad. So an example of this is one that's used a lot is somebody running with prosthetic legs. And it's like, wow, if this person can run, why can't I, an able-bodied individual, run? So it's looking at their experiences to try to make themselves feel better. It looks like a lack of understanding. So people using diagnoses as adjectives or lack of knowledge about general diagnoses. So this is something that happens a lot, right? Saying, oh, she's so OCD, when you might not even know what constitutes that diagnosis of OCD. And is that okay to use somebody's very real experiences and very real diagnoses as an adjective for a person who may not actually have OCD? It also looks like professors denying registered accommodations. It's not focusing on person-first behavior. So a clear example of this is talking to a service animal instead of the handler, or taking pictures of service animals without consent. So this is something that happens a lot. Say somebody is deaf and they need an interpreter, and you speak directly to the interpreter instead of speaking to the deaf person. That's not okay. That would be like taking somebody's cane away from them and touching their mobility device. It's important to focus on the person, not their disability, and not their service animal or their interpreter or their support person. That person is there to support them, and you can imagine them as an extension of that person themselves, right? So it's just something that they need to function. And the last example is ableist language, which we will have examples going forward of what this looks like, but it kind of goes into that example that I used under lack of understanding of using an diagnosis as an adjective. So when I said, oh, you're so OCD, that would be ableist language. So this slide says, you are not immune to ableism. And the image description is a person wearing green shirt, blue pants, using cane wrapped in hazard tape. And this was taken directly from an article in the McMaster students newspaper called The Silhouette. And when I say you are not immune to ableism, it means nobody is immune to ableism, even folks who experience ableism. Ableism is so deeply ingrained into every aspect of our lives that most of the time we don't even realize that it's happening, that we're perpetuating it, or that we're being victimized by it. The use of language might be one of the most pervasive ways that ableism creeps into everyday lives. The use of language is looking at, in this context, creating inclusive language, because inclusive language facilitates inclusive spaces and events. It makes people feel safe. It makes disabled people feel valued. It doesn't lead to microaggressions. So there's a lot of commonly used harmful language that is so deeply ingrained in our everyday conversations that we might not even realize that we're using it. Some examples of this are crazy, dumb, psycho, lame, moronic, insane, and the R word, which I will not be repeating here. It, it's just not okay. And so it's looking at, these are examples of words you can use instead of these words. So something like when we use the word crazy, that can mean a whole plethora of different things. But it's important to look at, no, what did I really mean when I'm trying to describe this? If somebody was quote unquote lame, what does that mean? What am I attributing that to? And how can I say it in a way that doesn't offend somebody else? So these are examples of words you can use instead. So instead of crazy, you can use wild or unreal or absurd or ridiculous. This is really just a list of words that you can use instead of any of these words. You can look at awful, overwhelming, disappointing, uncool, silly, frustrating. I think something that's really important to point out in this slide is that when we're looking at synonyms, so words you can use instead, a lot of those words are describing something negative. Something's awful, something's disappointing, something's uncool, something's frustrating, something's silly, something's ridiculous. When we use those ableist words on the left and we really mean the words on the right, we're associating people who might be called these things as lesser than people. Like, oh, that's insane. You meant that's awful, but you're equating the term insane to a real person who's had that term used against them as a slur. So it's important to look at how our language can create deficits, and it's important to acknowledge when you say these words, it's okay. They're so ingrained in how we speak in our everyday language, and it's something you have to be very mindful of. Of course, people make mistakes. Of course, people still use this language. It's being cognizant of when you use it or when you hear somebody else use it that it clicks in. Oh, wait, no, what I really meant was wild, for example. So far in this presentation, we've covered a lot of information, and you may be wondering, okay, well, how does this relate to me? What is social work's role in confronting ableism? Why do I need to know about the different concepts and frameworks of defining disability? Why do I need to change my language to make it more inclusive? This next section of the presentation will focus on ableism in the workplace and what is the role of social work. A big way to acknowledge and to combat ableism in the workplace is anti-oppression. So, ableism in the workplace looks a lot like things that we've been talking about throughout this entire presentation. It looks like experiencing the various kinds of accessibility barriers. It looks like using ableist language. It looks like the lack of understanding and using microaggressions, even though we're not aware of it. Like said before, ableism is so pervasive in our everyday lives that most of the time we don't even realize when things are ableist. As practitioners, it's important to confront our own ableism. Nobody's immune to it. Even myself, as someone who does this for a living, it's not something that I'm completely immune from. Nobody is. And that's okay. It's acknowledging that and then moving forward, knowing that, okay, ableism exists, and what am I doing? I think a large part of how we can challenge ableism in the workplace and confront it is aiming to work from an anti-oppressive standpoint. So this would be anti-oppressive practice, AOP for short. And I argue that this is the starting point for this, for confronting ableism in the workplace, for acknowledging it, for challenging it, and for dismantling it. So anti-oppression is not only initiated by the circumstances in individual cases, but can also be initiated as a result of the patterns we see in our work and the outcomes it produces. So specifically, my example is I'm doing my placement in a hospital setting, with youth with mental health, and you hear a lot of ableist slurs, microaggressions, what have you, being thrown around by other healthcare practitioners. And a lot of the time, it's just so deeply internalized and so embedded within the systems that you might not even realize that it's happening, right? So, of course, there's individuals in this healthcare setting that experience and oppression through ableism. But a big part is noticing that that's a pattern and the outcomes that it produces. These youth could hear that language. They could face stigma for it and understand what that means and feel like they're not welcome or cared for. So that's why I argue that anti-oppression is a big way to be able to combat this. A way to practice anti-oppressive practice is through actually engaging in the real life work. You've been given a lot of theory and a lot of information today, and you might be thinking, okay, well, how does this apply to me? How do I use this in my social work practice? So this scenario should be a way for you to try to engage with some of the information given and how you would proceed using an anti-oppressive approach. So this is the scenario. Your coworker comes into the room after interacting with a patient and says, "They're crazy." Someone replies saying, "Yeah, you should see what brought them in. They're insane." You know, based on this training, that these words are rooted in ableism. How would you proceed? So based on the previous scenario, there's a few different things you could say. You can challenge this directly by saying things like, "Hey, I don't like when you use those words because they are ableist." Or, "Hey, maybe instead of saying things like insane or crazy, you can try unique or frustrating." People might not always respond great to saying they are ableist when words are said, because a lot of people, again, don't realize when you have such deeply ingrained ableism and sanism in systems and in culture and in language that they are even doing this. You could explain how these words can be offensive to individuals, and you can choose to do that in a group or individual setting. So one of the options here is you can approach specific individuals after the incident in private and explain how these words can be offensive to individuals. I think however you chose to approach this situation and however you choose to be reflexive with your practice and taking context into account, because anti-oppressive practice, there's no one-size-fits-all formula. Anti-oppressive practice is really about being reflexive, taking context into consideration, and understanding what's appropriate at that time and place. However, the one key message that I would encourage you to take away when you are engaging in anti-oppressive practice in regard to ableism is make sure you emphasize that you're not picking on someone by calling them out. You're just letting them know gently that certain words can be offensive and oppressive to groups of people so that they know that going forward. They might not know that a patient might not appreciate them saying crazy. They might not know that some of their coworkers and fellow healthcare practitioners experience some kind of disability and have had those terms used against them in a negative way. And saying this gently challenges them to rethink about what those terms mean and to be very purposeful with their language. There's also other ways to shift conversations. So there's many direct and indirect ways to stop conversations even, not even just shifting them. And a lot of these depend on your comfort level and again, on the context. Like shown before, you can interrupt and stop the conversation directly. You can challenge the individual's language. What did they maybe actually mean to say? When they say, oh, a patient came in, they're crazy, you should see what they did, mean, well, what did they do? What did they do that's crazy? Did you mean to say that was surprising? Again, it gets people to focus on using purposeful language. Or you can just bring up a new topic and try to keep focus on that. As somebody who identifies as disabled, something that comes up a lot in the workplace are ableist slurs, and these are microaggressions. And I have an invisible disability, which means that folks do not know by looking at me that what they're saying could be harmful. Not that it excuses it, but I'm more likely to hear a lot of, especially sanist slurs, against the youth that I work with that have been used against myself. And bringing up a new topic and trying to keep focus on that has been really helpful because it's not always working with service users. You have to also be mindful of your coworkers and the other social workers around you. Social workers can be disabled, whether they choose to disclose that to you or not. So it's not even being aware of how would your client feel. Sometimes it's also being aware of just how would my coworker feel. It's impossible to know if someone's disabled just by looking at them. And that's something very important that I hope you take away from today's presentation. As we approach the end of this presentation, we will be looking at what is the role of social work specifically in understanding ableism, understanding disability, understanding the various models. Hopefully it's become clear throughout this presentation what the role of social work is, but I hope to just make it clear and tie up all the loose ends, and then we will be finished. Hearing about all this, these are implications for practice, and this is the role that I feel, well, sorry, I should specify, it's one of the roles I feel that social work should be taking in this. So, learning is necessary for practitioners to demonstrate effective AOP that's informed by the experiences of people disabled by the social environment and follows the trajectory of the disability social movement. So again, if we're looking at disability from the social model lens, we understand that society disables folks and that environments disable folks. And it's necessary to understand this learning because not only does it align with the disability justice movement, which focuses on the social model of disability, but it helps to reframe it in a less anti-oppressive way, because we know historically that the sciences, again, psychiatry, psychology, etc., have been used as tools of oppression. We even know that social work has been used as a tool of oppression against folks who identify as disabled. So learning this is the first step to understanding the history and understanding what you can do moving forward and practice in a way that's actually anti-oppressive. So whether you are part of macro level structural changes in society or seeking effective means of working with clients, these foundations that you've learned today are necessary to understand the concept of ableism and its social impacts. You can help to diminish the social element of disability for your clients. As a social worker practitioner, it is important to consider one's own ableism so one does not stereotype against the clients that they're working with. And I hope that's something that has become clear today. When you confront your own ableism, you can also help to diminish the ableism experienced by the folks you're working with. And you will also be working on not exerting your ableism on others. This, in turn, helps to form a positive worker-client relationship, which, as we know, is one of the main goals of a social worker. So if you're open and honest about your ableism, it will help the client be more comfortable with you and help them teach you about their disability. So again, not all disability is obvious. You might be working specifically in agencies that work with disabled folks, but there's a lot of folks who have invisible disabilities or who might not disclose their disability. You should always assume, almost in any practice setting, that you will come in contact with somebody who is disabled. And that's why it's important to be aware of ableism and saneism in social work and in your practice, because if you're open and honest about it, it encourages folks to be able to want to disclose to you. Thank you for taking the time to finish this presentation. I've listed a few resources here at McMaster that you could turn to for further learning on these topics. So you have Access Mac, which is through the Equity and Inclusion Office at McMaster. You have MSU Access, which is a McMaster Student Union, and this is a student-run group on the area of disability on campus, and they have the only critical disability studies library on campus. You can also check out the website for the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. So they are local. They're located in Hamilton, and they are an amazing group with lots of information around all these things, and again, located locally.